Thanks for tuning in to The Leadership Beat, a Bates Communications original podcast series exploring leadership trends and inspiring leaders to innovate and think differently.
Hello, welcome to The Leadership Beat. This is Andy Atkins. I'm Senior Vice President of Research, Innovation, and Practice at Bates Communications, and today I'm joined by Russ Eisenstat. Russ is the Executive Director for the nonprofit Center for Higher Ambition Leadership. CHL is a community of corporate leaders committed to building higher performing organizations and a better world. CHL supports companies as they strive to deliver superior value for all their shareholders over the long term through a CEO community, purpose-driven leadership development, and a rich collection of research and practical tools. Russ formed CHL together with leading CEOs with an ambition to deliver superior social value as well as economic value. These CEOs also believe that operating in this way would help them build stronger, higher-performing organizations. Several of the founding CEOs were featured in the book he co-authored, Higher Ambition: How Great Leaders Create Social and Economic Value. Prior to CHL, Russ was a faculty member at the Harvard Business School, a senior advisor at McKinsey & Company, and founder and president of TruePoint, a mission-driven consulting company. He's an expert on large-scale organization change, innovation, and strategy. Russ, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here, Andy.
It's a pleasure getting a chance to talk with you about higher ambition leadership. And just let's start on the most basic of areas. What is it that distinguishes a higher ambition company?
So I think one thing that doesn't distinguish a higher ambition company is ambition, right? So, we live in a competitive world and a competitive market, and I think, all CEOs want to win. They want to be successful. The question is, what's the standard you set for yourself and the standard you set for your company? Higher ambition companies are companies that say it's not just enough to make the quarter. It's not just enough to meet the requirements and demands of your shareholders. That creating value for your customers, for your people, for society is both the right thing to do. It's the best way to be motivating your people, and it's also the best way to build a successful organization for the long term.
So what brought you to studying higher ambition companies? What was the genesis of the idea for you?
So, this started out as a research project about 2006, and we had been consulting to a number of CEOs around organizational alignment issues. And frankly, we really weren't going out in search of higher ambition. We started by interviewing CEOs who we knew had been very successful financially and had really done that over a sustained period of time. And as we went out and we spoke to them, we found that these leaders had a very different way of putting the pieces together than certainly the traditional management style that I had grown up with, which was much more of an economically driven model of the firm.
Yeah, absolutely. I just reflecting on my own time in business school, and you were reflecting just in your comment. So much of the time we were drilled into us that we were supposed to maximize shareholder returns. That was the purpose of the organization, the purpose of the corporation. And so really thinking about this as something more than that, that's a bit of a shift in frame, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it really is. And in some ways, I think, for a lot of us who grew up professionally in the 80s and 90s, and I think about, even teaching at the Harvard Business School in the late 80s, in the early 90s, we had this view that somehow you had to leave your values at the door, right? That, talking about values and purpose somehow wasn't what real business leaders did. And it got, I think, drilled into us in a lot of different ways. And I think it was a revelation, frankly, to be interviewing these CEOs who are not bashful about talking about purpose, not bashful to talk about contribution, I think about Ed Ludwig, who talked about great place to work, great performance, and great contribution to society, and holding that up as a banner for the company, and believing it. And what was interesting, particularly for me, was to look at CEOs. Becton Dickinson, which was where Ed was the CEO. BD was always a great company, but before Ed and his predecessor, they didn't talk that way, and there was just a whole different level of energy released in the company. When they were able to really talk in a way that connected economic value with values, and a deeper sense of the kind of contribution that the enterprise was making.
Russ, you talk about social purpose and social value, and it strikes me that if we're thinking about a company like Becton Dickinson, which is a healthcare company, it isn't too much of a stretch to think about the products and services that they're creating as creating a social good. After all, you're healing people, or you're contributing to better health outcomes. But I'm wondering, when you're talking about dealing with both economic value and social value, whether it's required that a company create a product or service that you inherently recognize as a social good.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that a lot of our CEOs, not in healthcare, talk about in terms of how do you think about purpose and what that's about. I want to come back to that in just a second. I mean, one thing, though, I will observe is that even in healthcare, it's remarkable the number of healthcare companies that haven't made that connection.
It is,
right?
Isn't it?
And so,
a little disturbing.
Yeah, exactly. So you would think it's low-hanging fruit, and yet, and again, Becton Dickinson was a good example where they had been founded as a company, as a medical products company. You talk to people historically, that was very much what they were about. But there was a whole movement in this country towards professional management, and very much, a focus on economic discipline, back to the whole Milton Friedman approach to the firm. And that had gotten lost in those companies. I think the flip side is that even if you're not a company, if you're not in healthcare or someplace directly connected, what we found is that virtually any company can make that connection. I mean, one of the companies in the center, Masonite, is a door company, and very values-driven CEO Fred Lynch. The connection to values was always there for them as a company. And when you talk to Fred about the turnaround of Masonite, he said, we would not have made it. We would not have been able to go through the tough times we went through if we hadn't been absolutely rock solid in our values to keep people with us. But purpose was a harder question for them. And, they went through a process in defining a purpose statement, which is that we help people to walk through walls, which is a very simple way of thinking about, well, what is a door? It's something that helps people to walk through walls. But they really took that to a much deeper place, which connected back to the culture of the company, which is that they are genuinely a company and a culture around enabling other people to be successful. And they further thought about, well, who are the people who work at Masonite? And they have it's a manufacturing culture. Many of the people who work in their plants, many of them don't have high school degrees, or certainly have not gone to college. They have a large immigrant population. And so they took that purpose statement and said, well, what does this mean? Well, first of all, we help each other to walk through walls. We help our customers to walk through walls. And then in the community, we help immigrants to walk through walls. And we help high school students to walk through walls. And the level of energy that people felt about being part of something that they really believed in, that people could come home on a Saturday morning and talk to their families about the work that they were doing, was just extraordinary, that was unleashed in the company. And if you think about social value as certainly being embodied in a great product, but also embodied in being a great place to work, in being a great corporate citizen, that sense of purpose it certainly begins again back on the product and service, but it goes well beyond that.
So it can be kind of outward facing in the product and service realm, but also in some ways internal to the organization around what's the kind of workplace that you're creating.
Exactly.
I think you and I have previously talked about one of the companies I've been privileged to work with. It's the shoe company Aldo in Canada, and their CEO David Bensadoun. And one of the things that became important for them as they were doing their own purpose work was thinking about, for their own employees, the opportunity that employment at Aldo provided for employees to get a foothold and enter the workforce and have a great career. But also externally focusing, you might think, shoes, so where's the social purpose in that? But for them, it was very much about identifying important firsts for people. That first interview, the first date,
right.
Those sorts of things, and being able to provide a product that improved the individual's experience of those important firsts.
Right. And if you think about Patagonia, right? I mean, they're a clothing company, and yet they've created such an extraordinary meaning about the product because it is related and connected to a higher purpose. Cummins Engine, it's a diesel engine company.
So where do you make the connection there?
Yeah. Well, so for them, it's about mobility, but it's also about environmental responsibility. So, and also this connection to competitive advantage. So Cummins, interestingly, really pushed the envelope on emission standards well ahead of what was being required of them. When the EPA kind of caught up with them, they had a sustainable competitive advantage because they were doing the right thing and they were presenting the product in a way that was really connected to sort of a broader social context.
One other connection that strikes me here is a lot of companies have focused on efforts around corporate social responsibility. And I do wonder about that connected to what we're talking about here is higher purpose. Because on the one hand, you could say, well, that's just another expression of it. On the other hand, I could also say, well, that's kind of, for some companies, off to the side, and we're checking the box there. So what's the connection that you might see there?
All higher ambition companies do a lot of work in the community, certainly all of the ones that I've connected to in terms of those CEOs. But I think, Andy, as you're highlighting, in a lot of companies, that work is pretty separate from the core of the business, right? So it's a little bit of the Sunday school phenomenon. You do 6 days a week, you do whatever you're doing, and then on Sunday you do something else. And I think for these companies, it's not that these aren't good folks, but there's a real bifurcation between the social value work, the work that happens with the corporate foundation, and the core of the business. What you find in higher ambition organizations is a much deeper integration in ways that the community, it's not that all of the work that they're doing is necessarily directly connected to achieving profit. So certainly there is a lot of volunteer activity, but it's very much more connected both to core capabilities of the organization, to the strategy of the organization, and to the purpose of the organization.
I think about an example of Tory Burch. Happens to be another shoe company, but when Tory founded her company, she got a lot of counsel from folks not to use the elevator pitch, if you will, that she was using, because she led with the idea that she was interested in being able to have a foundation right from the beginning in order to support women entrepreneurs. And that was part and parcel of what she was doing right out the gate. She got a lot of flack for that. People saying you'll never raise money for your company if you've got both of those pieces. But she said, no, this is part of who we are. And there was a tension there that she was holding that was part of what was part of her business plan, but also part of what it meant to go into business for her. And it seems to me that there's, in some ways, this tension that's inherent in what we're talking about. And you and I have talked about this a little bit, and it comes up in the book as well. The both-and thinking, or the simultaneous solve, the recognition that it's often not a matter of saying, well, I'm going to either be pursuing economic value or I'm going to pursue social value, but that there's a strength, actually, in being able to pursue both. And tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we realized when we wrote the book, and certainly in our subsequent conversations and engagement with higher ambition leaders, is that you talk about the role of leadership. That what higher ambition leaders do is they hold the center.
Mm-hmm.
They really they stand for something in a place that in some sense embodies the best of what that firm is about. My guess is the example that you're describing, that female entrepreneurship is core to what that brand is about,
Yes.
what it stands for in a deeper way. But that's not the obvious short-term place to be going.
Right.
And I think what these leaders are doing is really saying, look, if you think about the notion of shared purpose and a higher purpose, it becomes that place that brings together things that are seeming opposites, right? So a sense of aspirations that matter for people and the tangible benefits of the product, but in a way that come together in a powerful and compelling brand. And in the short term, it's very easy to bifurcate those things, certainly just simply focus on the short-term product-related issues. But if you're going to create a firm that really stands for something and builds a level of trust in your people and in your stakeholders, then then there's that need to hold the center.
And take that longer term
That's
view.
right.
At the same
Take that
time.
longer term view.
Yeah.
In a way that says, the economic value and the social value, the short term and the long term, aren't opposites. They're really what you need to bring together in order to build a great company.
What would be an example of a leader holding center?
So I'll give you a couple of examples. So one is Henry Schein, which is also a medical products company, a medical distributor. And it's interesting. Stan Bergman, the CEO, one of the things that he's insisted on is that when they interview someone, they have something like 10 or 15 interviews before they hire somebody for Schein. And people come in and it's kind of crazy, right? Okay, I've interviewed once and I've come back and I've interviewed all a set of other people and so on. And hiring managers say, well, let's kind of move on. I need to get a hire and move on. But part of the essence of the culture of Schein and part of the secret sauce is what they Team Schein, and a consistency and a fit with the culture. And it's exactly holding to that cultural norm that really is part of what creates an extraordinary team that's allowed Schein to be successful for the longer term. I'll give you another example, sort of in the strategy, in the strategy realm. Again, back to Beck and Dickinson. BD, they make a lot of billions of products, small products, and so one of their key product areas is in the area of insulin syringes. So the syringes that you use in hypodermic needles that people use in medical settings. In the late 90s, there was a significant issue around unintentional needle sticks, which was particularly an issue relative to AIDS, and you had nurses and other people who were sticking themselves with the product. And BD has a very capital-intensive manufacturing organization. So they had billions of dollars invested, and they were the dominant player in terms of creating insulin syringes, not traditional insulin syringes where this was the real issue. It would have been very easy for Beck and Dickinson to say, well, look, hospitals need to take precautions, but it's not really our role as a manufacturer to worry about that, or they could have done things around the margin. What BD did was exactly the opposite, which is to say, look, this is a social issue that really matters. And we're going to instead of dragging our heels on it, we're going to be leading the charge for a whole approach to safety, and we're going to be engaging with the nurses, we're going to be engaging with the legislatures and other bodies to say this is where the whole industry needs to go. And they fundamentally wound up changing the industry, making the multi-billion-dollar investment and reworking their manufacturing, coming up with a whole new product line. And on one level, that's about values. It also led to a new high margin, innovative product line for them. And so you talk about holding the center, it's saying, look, both social value matters, and we need to do that in a way that's economically responsible and in a way that allows us to be growing over time. And so if you think about that, back to holding that tension, there's a short-term, long-term set of dimensions around that, certainly, around being willing to make the investment in the short term when you don't know necessarily it's going to work out and the new product is going to be there. But there's also an economic and social value piece that says, look, as a company, we need to be able to do both.
One of the things that we found in our own research is that one of the characteristics that distinguishes leaders who are particularly good at leading innovation is they can hold attention. They have that ability. It's not that they come up with a great idea themselves, right, but they're really good at holding the tension and knowing how to, as Ron Heifetz would say, to moderate the temperature on the change. The social value, the holding center on social value, in the example you were giving,
yes,
is a source of innovation. Social
yes,
value, solving for that side of it actually opens up new opportunities as opposed to limiting the opportunities that you have.
Exactly. And I mean, it's back to Michael Porter's whole notion around shared value, which is all about unmet social needs, right? Which then become new markets and opportunities for the business to grow. And it's precisely, I think, in that tension, which is, well, how do you deal with those social issues in a way that also works given the capabilities of the firm and the reality of the marketplace, which is a wonderful recipe for innovation.
I'm wondering when a CEO or a senior leader is trying to pursue the simultaneous solve, hold the tension there, and so forth, and you've got to make the case to your board about the value of not just maximizing economic value, but both. Can you relate a little bit about what you've seen in terms of managing the board?
That's a great question. I think there are multiple dimensions to that. I think one of the things that you find in higher ambition companies is that even in terms of the selection for who's on the board, you're looking for leaders who have that same orientation and mindset. And so, the Becton Dickinson board, certainly a set of really first-rate business people, but also leaders who are more sophisticated around those dimensions. I think the other things that we hear a lot from our CEOs is you kind of have to earn the right. And that part of what allows CEOs to have the freedom to be able to really talk longer term is that there's also the discipline around making the quarter, and putting together the business case in a way that the pieces fit together. So it's back to that both end.
It is. It's that simultaneous solve.
Exactly.
The short-term results, but also the long-term value.
That's right. One of the phrases that one of our CEOs used in the book was this whole notion of building the future one quarter at a time. And, by the way, that's also how you figure out innovation. It's not all at once. It's let's probe, let's test what the safety strategy could be. Let's try for those early wins and begin to say, is there a real opportunity there? Be able to go to the board and say, look, this isn't just a pipe dream. We've tested it in a market and, in a particular geography or whatever else, and there's an opportunity here.
Any perspectives that you've gained about how they've engaged with their leadership teams in this context? Because I get the sense this isn't the lone hero phenomenon, but it takes a pretty much aligned team to make this happen.
In almost all cases, what you find is that there are often 3 or 4 different senior leaders who play complementary roles at the top of the company. And one may be, and so the CEO is obviously plays a critical role in holding the center, but they are not the Lone Ranger. They're very much working with a set of colleagues who share, I think, a common vision and who play complementary roles. One may be much more focused operationally, another more externally, more of a people person versus an operations person, an internal person, an external person, and so on. And the ability to be putting that together and much more of a collective model of leadership.
Developing the plans, developing that vision, developing that sense of purpose isn't necessarily the work of a single leader, but far more a matter of a leadership team or the community of leaders at the top, aligned around that to drive that forward. Or is that a variable story?
Yeah, so I what I would say is that the CEO is pretty key.
Yeah.
So, the CEO's leadership in mobilizing and engaging that team, and given the set of centrifugal forces
Right.
on any set of folks,
Just pull 'em right apart, yeah.
sort of the ability of the CEO to say, look, this is where we are, and this is a direction that we need to be going in, and this is work we need to be doing. I think there's certainly a key role for that individual leader, but they're not doing it alone, right? I mean, they're doing that as part of a broader team that they're engaging and mobilizing, and people who have complementary skills. Interesting. I'm talking a lot about Becton Dickinson, but one of the things that just one of the companies I know best, but one of the things that was fascinating about them as we looked at them in the research is that saw a management succession, and there were 4 leaders, all of whom who could have been the CEO. And in most companies, the other when one of them became the CEO, the other 3 would have left. All 4 of them stayed, and all 4 of them took on very significant roles in the company. And then when the first person who became CEO left, another one of them became the next CEO, and the 2 others again continued to stay and do extraordinary work. And so I think, this sense of a commitment to the company, and not just to your own career, I think is also something that's you see in a lot of higher ambition companies. Certainly saw the same thing at Herman Miller, Henry Schein, a number of companies where, you see the sense that, people, it's not just about people's individual advancement. There is a sense that being at the company is really an extraordinary opportunity for people to grow and to exercise leadership, not just hierarchical leadership.
And maybe that's another one of those dualities we're talking about. We've talked about short-term versus long-term, economic versus social. Perhaps it's a matter of the collective purpose versus individual purpose as well, in terms of being able to provide an opportunity to do great work together, but also for individuals to become their fullest selves.
Exactly.
To really bring all of themselves, that real sense of belonging as a leader, as part of the team.
No, exactly. No, I think that question, Andy, that you're touching on about individual purpose and collective purpose, I think is a really important one. One of the things I would observe is there's in the last year, and I think this is a good thing. Larry Fink wrote the letter to shareholders a year ago, actually to CEOs a year ago, and then he wrote a follow-up this year, as the chairman of BlackRock, around the importance of purpose and the expectations that companies would articulate a purpose and a long-term vision for their companies that goes beyond just the financial, and a belief that in terms of long-term economic success, that was an important thing to be doing. And so you have a lot of companies that are developing corporate purpose statements.
Right.
But I think there's a potential, you and I have all seen kind of the fad du jour.
Right.
And I worry about, companies creating one more purpose statement that goes up on the wall, but that isn't really in a deep way connected to the individuals in the organization. And I think the question, what you see in higher ambition organizations is they really make that link between, well, what am I doing every day when I get up in the morning and I spend 8 hours of work, and broadly where the company is going to. And if it's just something that's happening at the corporate level, I go in and I feel alienated and frustrated at the work I'm doing, that's a recipe for burnout and alienation. One of the areas where certainly you see this playing itself out in a really sad way is in healthcare. It's hard to imagine, we talked about this before, but healthcare providers, the purpose of a hospital is really clear, and the people who go in and become physicians and nurses are people who are very purpose-driven, and yet the nature of that work has really evolved in a way where you have 50% burnout rates. And so people's ability to make that purpose real in their work, connected to the larger purpose, isn't there. And so that whole question of how do you activate purpose in a way that connects what's happening at the enterprise level with what people are doing in their daily work, I think is a fundamental management and leadership issue in any higher ambition organization.
Well, on the subject of a better way to manage, maybe as a way of summarizing some of what we've talked about here, in a couple of sentences, how might we summarize what really distinguishes higher ambition leadership from just good general leadership practice? What is it that makes it distinctive?
The first thing I would say, Andy, is that you got to get the management fundamentals right. So I think, to me, this is the extra secret sauce that you add on to all the things that you and I learned and have been teaching people over the years. I think there are two things that to me, really make a difference. One is that my experience is that successful higher ambition leaders are grounded in who they are as human beings. So there's an authenticity about what they're doing, about what happens, and what they ask of people in the workplace. It's very much connected to who they are as human beings and how they show up. And I think the second piece is this connection to a sense of higher purpose and values, and a sense of meaning, that you are engaging people, that creating a sense of meaning and contribution for people is part of the work of leadership.
It's an interesting convergence of what you're saying with a conversation I know you and I have had previously, which is in some of our own research. We've found that among the characteristics that most distinguish leaders of high growth organizations, successful high growth organizations, is that sense of authenticity and the integrity around values. I mean, those are really key differentiators that go beyond the cost of entry in leadership.
Yeah. And if you have that integrity, you could do extraordinary things, right? You were talking earlier about innovation. I want to go back to Masonite. I mean, they had to do some really tough things. They had to go through major downsizing in order to right-size the enterprise and get it to the right place. But they did it with humanity, and they did it with integrity. It wasn't a memo that came out from corporate headquarters. You know, the CEO went to the plant and he met people's eyes and he said, look, we're having to do some really hard things here. And we're doing it, in order to save a business that we all care about. But that's all about authenticity. I mean, you've got to be, that has to be real. It can't just be, corporate speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been great, Russ. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the dialogue.
Yeah, Andy, it's always a wonderful experience to be able to connect with you and to have these kinds of conversations. So thank you.
My pleasure.